Doesn't everything cost more in the cloud? The answer's kind of complex. It's yes and no. So in the cloud, we have a number of great capabilities that we don't necessarily have on-premise. So it's not a one-to-one relationship. But one of the things that we do see in the cloud is we do see a more direct tie from our expense to the value that's being delivered. Can it cost more? Sure. If I run the same size virtual machine inside of Azure as I do in my on-premise data center, where I've got hardware that I've expense as part of a capital expense and is spread across a number of different projects, yeah, potentially. But if I actually can take a look at services that auto-scale, if I can take a look at the actual resource utilization or the effectiveness of the service for the value, I can make money-saving choices, and I can also make sure that we're focusing on the real thing here. It's not the cost savings, it's the value delivery. It's the value for the dollar that we're getting. And the cloud helps make that a much easier determination.
Hey, it's Jay Gordon. Welcome back to AzureFunBytes, where we get together every week and what do? We talk about the services, the products, the people, and everything else that you can have in order to have a great experience with Azure. So every week I'm lucky to have a guest. And this time I actually have a repeat guest. And I just gave you a little preview of who he is. And one of the reasons that I showed that specific video is that, one of the things that we talk a lot about is the differences between running something on-prem and the costs as opposed to running something in the cloud. And once you're running it in the cloud, the differences between, say, running it as a VM and having to manage all that infrastructure as a service, or going for a platform as a service model. And so that brings us to talking about Azure SQL today. And to help me out, I've got Steve Murawski. Hey, Steve, how are you today?
Hey, I'm doing great, Jay. How about yourself?
I'm enjoying my few days before the holiday out here in the States. I know that we've all got plans on how to spend time with family and friends, and I am super looking forward to it. I have a huge barbecue plan that I'm going to be cooking so much food.
That sounds awesome, man. And I was just thinking back to the kind of the intro video that you played. Yeah, it's been a while. It's a completely different world that we're in from when we recorded that. From when people were actually getting together more frequently. We're starting to get back to that now, depending on where we are in the world. But so I know there's some holidays across the world. Some folks have holidays coming up this weekend. I know we do in the U.S. So yeah, if you can get together and have fun, do it. If not, if you got to be somewhere where you got to stay separate yet and stay safe, let's stay safe, stay healthy, and dig into some cloud.
Yeah, that's and that's what we're gonna do today. But I also wanted to wish our friends in Canada a happy Canada Day. Thank you so much for Kids in the Hall and bands like Voivod and all sorts of really cool stuff you all provide to us. We all enjoy our neighbors to the north. Just want to give you a quick shout out. Happy Canada Day. It's Thursday, and every Thursday we do this. And one of the things that we do every week is we have a poll. And I wanted to go ahead and share this week's poll. I know that you all are always great about answering the questions and being part of the show. So this week, our poll is pretty simple. Are you using Azure SQL? I just want to know. And the reason I want to know is that because it gives us some idea of how familiar you may be with the service. And so I'd ask you to go over to aka.ms/learntv and make sure also, if you have questions, right here. Right here, you can put in your questions there and ask me something. So I'm asking you something in this poll. I want you to ask us something. And remember, if you're watching, there's a ton of URLs that I've got on a lot of the stuff that we're talking about today. You can go ahead and you can check those out also on the Learn TV website. And if you're watching on YouTube or Twitch or Twitter, feel free to use your native chat service. We've got support for it. We'll go ahead. We'll see your questions. We just want you to really get some time to get involved and enjoy this opportunity to talk to Steven. You always come with some great information. And today, I think we're going to talk a little bit about Azure SQL and what actually goes into using it, how we can move into it. I've got our agenda for today. Let's take a look at it really quick. We're going to be talking about what is Azure SQL, what are the Azure SQL options that you have for yourself, how to create, administer, query that database, networking and access control, so securing our data before we actually put it into production, because we're shifting left. We're thinking about security closer to the beginning than we are to the end of our software development release cycle. And then we'll also see if there's some new and interesting stuff we got time to talk about. And so, Steven, there's that first question: what is Azure SQL? And I'd love for you to kind of give us your definition.
Yeah, so you've got the docs page up there where they kind of define it. But Azure SQL's been this kind of growing area of support, right? It is the different offering types that we have for SQL Server services on Azure. And it started out really back with like just a hosted offering, and it was rather limited. And it's grown to encompass a couple. Now there's 3 distinct services in the Azure SQL kind of family. There's Azure SQL Database, and that's the hosted service. There is a managed instance, which is a hosted service, but it offers a little bit more customization to you. And then there's the SQL virtual machines. And SQL virtual machines is we're running SQL Server in a virtual machine, and there's some nice additional insights that you can get and some helpers for administration. And the order that I just talked about them is in order of how much work you have to do to administer the thing. Mm-hmm. So with the Azure SQL database, Azure does most of the things for you. That is the most hands-off. Hey, you don't have to touch much of anything. You give us data. You send us queries. We give you responses, right? And I say it's your data, your database, right? But the impact of what you have to do to manage things, right?
I really like this chart from the docs, because I think it gives you a kind of full view of what exactly each offering kind of brings to the table. And the most work obviously is the SQL virtual machine. And I think the reason why a lot of people are moving away from that way of hosting their SQL servers is that there's a lot of overhead that goes into doing that. You want to talk a little bit about that overhead?
Yeah. So, it's the same as it's almost the exact same amount of work as running it in your on-premise environment. You manage the operating system. You manage the SQL Server instance, all of it, right? Like I said, there's some nice helpers. So, there's some helpers to do some patching and things, but they are not, and to provide an easier insight into, some of what's happening on the machine inside the Azure portal or through Azure tooling. But ultimately, you are fully responsible for the life cycle of all of those things. You're dealing with your patch windows. You are looking at performance. So you're responsible for making sure you have the right type of storage underneath so that you get the performance you need on the reads. All of that. You're dealing with backups. If you need high availability, That is all that's all something you're responsible for with the SQL VM. It's the easiest transition because you're already doing all of those things, or you're probably doing all of those things in your on-premises environment. If this is a net new project, you're not. But if you're looking at a migration story, right, that is the most straightforward migration because it's literally what we're doing on premises in the cloud in a VM there, right? So you're the only things you're adjusting to are like the new networking model inside the cloud because your network's not going to be the exact same thing. Your how you line up your disks, right? Because now it's not I get a bunch of disks, I stick them in an array, I'm formatting them, I'm deciding my RAID levels, stuff like that. Now you're picking from different storage options and seeing how that maps in the cloud, but the management of SQL Server experience is much more one-to-one.
Sure. And we've talked a little bit about migrations before, you and I, not necessarily on here, but we've discussed migrations. And one of the easiest ways people typically get started in the cloud with their apps tends to be that lift and shift methodology. The idea that you're basically just trying to replicate what you have as much in the cloud as you had in, say, your on-prem. And that could be, VMware VMs and their migration tools for that. It could be your Hyper-V setup. It could be any of these options. But the database tends to be its own animal because the database, it can be the start and finish of our business if we don't have that data available, up to date, and then of course backed up, because we think about RTO, RPO constantly, return, the return to recovery, the time that we need to have the recovery point that we're recovering to. We need to kind of keep those all in mind, and I think it becomes more difficult when the effort is shifted over to you in a place where you don't even have physical access.
Yeah.
Like you're just basically virtually plugging in network cards, you're virtually adding hard drives, and you're dealing with all the normal rigmarole of systems administration. So you don't really make it easier for yourself. But with Azure SQL, you're taking things to a bit of a better level for you overall, as far as being able to focus more on management and day-to-day tasks, improving the actual application that you're working on, as opposed to spending that time making sure that the latest backup works. And that's one of the things that I've learned, is that a lot of people have backups, but they don't necessarily know if their backups work. And that's one of the great things about this, is that Azure SQL has kind of a trusted backup system that's supported by the team at Azure.
Yeah, a lot of folks run backup jobs. Not a lot of people have backups. You don't actually have a backup until you've actually tested it, right? Because if you can't restore it, it's not a backup. It's not anything. We've run the backup job. We just don't know if it's a real backup or not. And so that can definitely be a hassle, right? And I like how you kind of position that about the migration story, right? Where we move kind of one-to-one into the cloud, and we start taking advantage of some of the services that are there to remove some administrative overhead. So we free up capacity to improve the things that we need to get to that next step, right? So, just moving the VM that I run from on-premises into the cloud, for example, for Azure SQL, I can start taking advantage of some of the auto patching services and the discovery. So where I might not have the visibility into understanding the state of my patch status, for example, I can get a much better visibility across a number of things, and those type of capabilities start to enable, and they open up that space to go from my hair's on fire, things are burning down around me, to all right, I've got a little bit of room. Let's see what it might look like to move to maybe Azure Managed Instance, right? And or even SQL database on Azure. And the reason we have those two offerings, right, is the managed instance makes it a lot easier to go from what I'm running on premise into a hosted offering, right? Where we take away, you don't have to care about the VM as much. You don't have to take care of the VM anymore, right? We're going to manage that part for you. But we align, and there's a lot more compatibility in what is offered on the SQL Server side of things for your workload. One of the challenges that people have going from that, I'm running SQL Server in a VM, I'm running it on premise on physical machines, to running it in the cloud is it's a subset of things supported, right? In order to effectively run these things at scale and provide a consistent management experience and things like that, things like SQL CLR, right? Where we can take .NET components and run them as part of as functions and capabilities and data types in our database. That adds complexity that you just can't pick up necessarily at scale in your service. So, SQL database on Azure doesn't support that, right? And so we have things like SQL Managed Instance to help us support some of those additional workloads that you can't, that make it an easier transition story. If I can't go all the way to SQL database which provides services for most of the things administrative that I need to do and provides a nice interface for that, at least gets me into a hosted where I take away some of the responsibility that I had to do with managing the operating system, managing some of the other capabilities around just getting the service to run itself.
And it gives you a whole lot more confidence in what you're doing when you've got the ability to know, if I need certain levels of service that go far beyond just needing a presented database, they're available. You can use those. And if you need something that's, giving you access to SQL Server Agent, if you need to have whatever, there are options for you and still giving you the power of the cloud. So even at a VM, you have the ability to do snapshots of your data and utilize the Azure storage services, the speed of the actual Azure network, the virtual networking, so that you could actually integrate it and peer it to other networks if you need to. So I think that being able to have a lot of those fundamental core services still available to you, along with a simple option. So you may have a few databases that just need, query and write access. That's really it. You're not doing anything special. You don't have any stored procedures, and you don't have anything that's really super specific to a particular version. And if you want something that we call versionless in Azure SQL, whereas, I think it's based on whatever the latest release of SQL is. It has some backported features to give you some compatibility. That also gives you that strength of not having to be overly concerned with the version of your database server, as opposed to the quality of the data, the security around it, all the big things that we need to kind of consider. And so, Stephen, I wanted to kind of move forward, but before we do, I want to make sure everybody's taking the poll. Make sure you head over to Learn TV and go ahead and hit the yes or no, or maybe it's complicated. Sometimes, you may be in the middle somewhere. You can let us know. We'd love to hear from you. And then one of the other big things that I want to remind people is a lot of the stuff that we're talking about today, you can get free education on. And so I think that's really super useful. Microsoft Learn has this Azure SQL fundamentals. You can see I've been going through it myself. I think it's a really great learning path for people who want to get the most out of their database as a service experience on Azure. So you get free education. You don't necessarily have to go out and pay for training unless you're getting into some really wild and wacky stuff. But you can get free education. So, Stephen, let's kind of move ahead with our our agenda for today. And so we'll go into next talking about let me pull it up, excuse me. Sorry.
It's all right.
We're going to talk a little bit about the creating a database.
Yeah.
And so I know there are a lot of options to create a database. You've got PowerShell, you've got Azure CLI, you've got the SDKs that you can use using your whatever language, just sending REST API responses. You can use the portal. You can use ARM and Bicep templates. I'm sure even there's plenty of other things that you could use like Terraform. But I like you to kind of show me what you've got.
Yeah. So I figure since we're doing kind of an introduction and tour around, I wanted to keep it pretty straightforward and start in the Azure portal, right? Because for me, the portal gives me a good exploratory. And if we're just starting to play with the service, this gives me a chance to kind of see some of the options, see what the happy path is. What does it seem like the common options are? And then I have something to kind of dig around and play around with. So I've been creating a few resources, but we're going to start from scratch. And I'm just going to go into my resource group that I've set up for today. And so we've got, like I said, I've already set some stuff up, but we're going to create something new. And I'm just going to go and create. And another reason I want is specifically for Azure SQL. Like I'm normally like, give me the command line, give me an ARM template, give me some infrastructure as code, and let's go. But for this in particular, I thought let's start here because this is one of the common or popular services, and so we can see SQL database. We have options for create. We can if you don't get the docs from Jay or the links from Jay here, right? Like you can get them from the portal. It'll take you right to the docs and to learn for this, but we're going to create. And there are a couple of concepts that I think the portal creation process kind of helps bring up. So we're focused on creating a SQL database. And so I need to give it my subscription, my resource group. We'll give it a name. Doing it live. And then it's asking me for a server. Now, I've already created one server, but I'm going to create a new one for this. Because if you didn't have one to begin with, you'd need to create a new server. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things we're going to see is there are some things that we configure at the server level, some things we configure at the database level. And so once we create this and we can go dig in, we can see some of the different settings that we have available at the two things. But let's give this a name. FunBytes SQL Live. And
super secret password.
Yep. Super secret password has to match. So ABC 1 2 3, and you pick a location. It all looks good. It's going to go create that server, and then we have some other options that
and just to give people an idea that there's two different things that we're creating here, if I'm right. So on the right where it says new server, we're actually creating like the logical server, and that's the actual place where the I suppose firewall rules, user authentication, things like that. That's all kind of built in there. Am I right? Am I wrong?
Yeah, and we're going to take a look. We're going to take a look at that. So that now you also might think, especially if you're familiar with app service, that's where your compute resources live, but that's not.
Okay.
So it really is a logical server, right? So it's kind of like a virtual IP for your server.
Okay.
But with a few more things on top of it, right? Like you mentioned, logins, right? So we'll when we pull up that resource, I think it'll start to become a little more clear. All right, so we've created the server. we have this option to use Elastic Pool. That's what may let us share resources between different databases, similar to an app service server farm. We're not going to do that for this one here. We're going to we can pick different compute and storage types. We can pick different backup redundancy. We're going to go take a look at networking next. And by default, if you create a SQL database, nothing can connect to it, right? Like you can hit the virtual network, but it's not going to let you talk. You can hit that network itself, but it's not going to actually talk to anything. And so we have to pick an endpoint type, and we can pick public endpoint, private endpoint. Private endpoint would have that thing live on our VNet that we had in our environment. We're going to do public endpoint, and it offers us some options here. So now we talk about firewall rules. So we can open it up so that Azure services can talk. So for example, if I had something running in app service that needs to talk to my SQL database, I could either whitelist specific IPs, or I can say, hey, let stuff from Azure talk to it.
Sure. So it kind of creates a one-to-one trust between it without actually having to go and whitelist everything individually.
And if I want to run tools from my current workstation, or if I want to run stuff from Office or somewhere else, I need to add those IPs to the firewall rules as well. Fortunately, as we create this resource, there's a little helper to say, hey, the IP that you're coming from, we can add that for you. And we can move on to security. Useful. So we're going to enable Azure Defender. We can start with a free trial. That is a paid service, so you got to make your determinations. But I think Azure Defender is a pretty awesome add-on. Now, this is one of the things I wanted to get to, is this additional settings. And so you can start with existing data. Now, this is an area where people get hung up. They might get a little upset. They might get a little frustrated. If we say backup, we can pick from backups of databases that we've been running on Azure. This is not go find the local database, the .back file that you have on your machine or on your server or something else somewhere else. Unfortunately, there's not a direct way to apply one of those backups to Azure SQL. There are other options we'll talk about getting our data into the cloud. So don't worry about that. But this
so that backup is specific to Azure SQL backups, say that you've done for other servers that are in your account. You can grab those, you can import them, so you can start off. And I guess that would be really useful if you have, say, development environments that are made on demand.
Yes. Yep. And then the last option here for a quick start, if you just want to get in and start playing around with something with actual data, you can hit sample, and in the AdventureWorks LT, which is the light version of the AdventureWorks database, it'll create that database for you.
And so that's some sample data to kind of go through. If you want to learn how to create queries, if you want to even learn how to back up your data, it's something to get started with.
Exactly. And then database collation. Now, if you've been running your own server, you can set this. You could change this. For Azure SQL database, it's this. This is the collation. This is your option. That's it.
So if you have something like Cyrillic that you need to have in your database, I would imagine that not using Azure like single database is the option. You're probably better going with, say, something like a VM. Am I kind of right? If you wanted to use one of those other collations.
Yeah, I was trying to remember, and I was just checking my notes. I forgot if managed instance supports other collations. I don't think it's in one of the quick notes, but you're either going to be in managed instance or SQL with in the Azure VM. So, all right, we can move on and we can review and create because I don't need any particular tags. It's going to tell me roughly how much it's going to cost to run. Now, there this is with dedicated CPU and storage resources. There's also a serverless pricing model, and there's a DTU pricing model.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about if you wanted to give us a little bit of a preview into the differences between DTU and vCPU.
Yeah.
Bill.
So DTU was the first pricing model that we had available for SQL, for the SQL Azure services, or for the Azure SQL services. The vCPU service, the vCPU pricing was added later. So the DTU gives you a combination of storage and compute based on kind of throughput, right? So and so you can get information out of each of the queries, kind of about what kind of what the DTU cost is for those things, and thereby scale your workloads appropriately. You could set up some auto scaling based on DTUs, or so if you wanted. There are some patterns for doing that, but it's a very fixed. It's a very fixed set of resources allocated based on DTUs. Mm-hmm. The vCPU model lets you vary your storage and compute a little bit and have a little bit more control over over the costs of what you have. And so we'll take a look at that when these resources are actually created. So I'm just hit and create. We'll let this thing go. And while that's creating, we can go look at the one that I've already stood up. And so that's going to go and get created. And we're going to start out by looking at that virtual server construct.
Okay.
And you know what? I'm going to call an audible. Since we were talking about pricing, let's actually go into the database and continue on and finish that thought out. So
sure.
It shows me the pricing tier for each of my databases. I'm going into the database resource itself. That's the thing that we wanted to create. And in settings, I have compute and storage. And this is where I can, so what I start with isn't what I have to keep. We can change these things as as things go, right? So I can start, as I mentioned, there's the provisioned and serverless options. So with serverless, it'll auto scale your compute resources, but your build per second that things are running. If you go with provisioned, your build per hour that it's configured. So if you have regular steady workloads, you tend to prefer the provisioned. Whereas if you think you're going to be pretty bursty, or you don't really know what you're going to be at, serverless can give you the serverless SKU may be more cost effective for you. So it's really going to be specific though to your workloads. But we can pick the service tier that we want. So there's 3 options under the vCore pricing model, and there's 3 options under the DTU pricing model, right? And so we could switch between these things after. So if we start with one and I really don't like this. It's not cost effective. Let's try out and explore one of the other options. We can definitely do that, and we can pick based on what our workload looks like. Do we need hyperscale? Is this a business critical thing where we need a very high transaction and throughput? And you can find definitions in docs as to what criteria actually business critical is, right? Because there's actual numbers and things around this. And similar with the DTUs, finding what actually matches for what they're. Now, based on the service tier that you have some different hardware configuration options, and we can change those. We can change them on the fly. Now, what happens is if we change these things, we may see an interruption in our application. So this is one of the biggest pain point areas, the interruption side of things, that I see in applications where people are targeting SQL Server. So it may or may not have come up on one of the previous episodes, but for example, I worked in operations at Stack Overflow for a while, and that's a .NET application running against SQL Server. There's other stuff in the environment as well, but the core of things were ASP.NET MVC websites hitting a SQL Server backend. And one of the challenges that you'd have, because we had a highly available SQL Server infrastructure, was if there was a failover, right? There's probably going to be like a little gap where queries fail, and finding the spots in your code to either catch that and retry, or do a little circuit breaker behavior, or go to a read-only replica. The application side of things, making the application side of things more resilient, tends to be the harder problem there. And so when you change your scale, when you change the hardware, when you change the amount of vCPUs provision, when you change, there's going to be a little blip in service. And so your application needs to be resilient enough to deal with a little connection gap when we make these changes. You're muted, Jay.
Because we're failing over to a different set of hardware, if you will, or virtualized hardware, and that's why we're getting that sort of little gap.
Yep. So, or we're reconfiguring the what hardware is dedicated. So in this case, for example, we got the Gen 5. We're not going to make a change there, but we could make a change, for example, to the vCores. So we could say, hey, 2 isn't giving me enough performance. Let's crank this thing up and do 24. Right?
Sure.
Or I need more memory, right? And I'm seeing memory pressure in my monitoring, and or I'm sorry, not memory pressure, but data size. Maybe our log growth or so. Like we can make these adjustments on the fly, and when we make these changes, it is going to change the hardware underneath a little bit, and so there's that momentary blip. But the services are brought back up online, and as long as our applications support it, it should be relatively transparent to our users.
Very cool. So we've got about 20 minutes left.
Yeah.
And I wanted to bring up one of the questions that we have really quick. Raku wanted to know, what are the main advantages of Azure SQL and its significance? I think we've talked about a few of them, but what do you think are the big ideas?
Yeah. Okay. Good question. So one of the main things that we start to see is when we move to the cloud, number one, we're opening up capacity, and we've talked a good bit about opening up capacity on our teams. So we're taking away common administrative tasks that we would normally have to go do. But one of the other major benefits that we get just by putting our workload inside of Azure is access to the experience and the tooling that's being built to improve that service. And that was a really generic statement, but what I'm leading to is this idea of like the intelligent performance section here, where we can take a look, and there's not going to be anything much here because I just spun these databases up. But if we look at like performance overview, the longer that we run our databases in the Azure Database Service, the more information that it gets, right? And you can get tuning recommendations.
So it'll give like recommendations around indexing or something like that?
Yep. Indexes, if you need to get faster storage, or there's a couple of you can go into performance recommendations. We can look at how queries perform against the database, right? All kind of here within the Azure portal. And then there's automatic tuning that we could turn on. And by default, those things are set at your server level, but you can override them at the database level. The Azure defaults set this force plan. So it forces it to reuse existing query plans, which can, if there's a matching one that exists, which can improve the performance of your queries. but you can also script the creation and dropping of indexes that are being, create indexes that may improve the performance, remove indexes that aren't getting used and are just taking up space. Now, and it's not just, so you may be familiar with like the query, the index recommendations in SQL Server. Like it'll look at a query and recommend indexes based on individual queries. But this isn't just that. That's that, and then run that through some machine learning and AI processing on the back end based on all of the Azure databases that we are running. So it's not just like to optimize one particular query. It's like it's so that, is this going to be beneficial in the overall health of the profile that we understand your database is being used?
Sure.
Right? So it provides more context into those recommendations than just like the query recommendations that we might see coming out of SQL Management Studio or something.
Gotcha. So you mentioning SQL Management Studio actually brings up a great kind of next part of our agenda, which is once you've actually created this, you've set up your IP firewall, you've begun maybe loading your data, or you want to start loading your data, I should say. Would you mind talking about like the administration options that we have?
Yeah, definitely. So right within, if we're staying in the portal, we have a query editor right here. So we can, go to the query editor. I can log in with my super secret password, or I could log in with Azure Active Directory, and I get a simple query editor, right? And this would let me go and explore tables or views, store procedures, run queries. That's a small subset of what we can do. Also on the advantages side of things, there's this Power Platform stuff. If you need to integrate into any of these things, right from Azure SQL, works really, really well.
Okay.
That was an aside from the previous. Now, for other tooling, you might be familiar if you've been doing SQL Server things with SQL Server Management Studio. SQL Server Management Studio has been a friend of mine. So this was introduced, I think, in SQL Server 2005. And in SQL Server 2000, if I remember, it was two separate tools, and they brought them together into one. But Management Studio will let you connect. Now, I apologize, the tree view there is actually pretty small, but this is pointing to my FunBytes demo database, my logical server, which I've whitelisted access to. And then I have my different databases here. I've got my AdventureWorks. I've got my, I've got a couple of versions of the AdventureWorks database here. And we have queries that we can run against that. We can just, yes, it didn't like my login. But should be good to go there. We can run our query. We can find, anyone who Jose1 has sold stuff to in the AdventureWorks database. We get back our query results. But I also can do things like manage my store procedures. I can do all sorts of fun stuff in terms of like I can script out my database. Most of the things that we've usually done inside of other database services. The other thing that SQL Server Management Studio lets us do is provides us a way to get our database into Azure. Now, for the production way to do this, I would say what Jay showed us in the on-prem to the cloud series for migrating your database, what you did there, Jay.
Sure.
With the database migration tools is the way to go. But we can also use Management Studio as we're starting to play around and explore.
Mm-hmm.
I can take a local database or one that's on a server near me, and in tasks, there's a deploy database to Microsoft Azure SQL Database. And when we do that, it pops up a little wizard to kind of walk me through. I connect to my server. I'm different name. I can specify some information about it. And what it's going to go through and do is it's going to look at my database itself and do some validation. And it's going to pull out the schema. It's going to script out all the logins and everything about this database, including the data, and then run that against my SQL Azure database and basically do some of the manual stuff for me to get my database in there. So you don't want to do this with a really huge database necessarily.
Sure.
But it provides you one way to kind of get started. I've got if I've got a development database that I want to try out and see how it works against SQL Azure, and you'll get errors like, hey, you can't have Windows logins transferred over. So you have to kind of, it'll help you clean your database up before you send things over. So
I really like that the database migration assistant application that we have. I thought that was super useful. I went over that in the on-prem to the cloud. The fact that what you're essentially doing is just putting in some information. It's doing some analysis, which I really like. And so getting some analysis that actually compares what you have to what you're getting. And you can even use that if you've gone to a virtual machine version of Azure SQL, or I should say Microsoft SQL, and you want to bring it from a VM into Azure SQL, single database or one of those other services, you can run an analysis and find out what type of instance that you're going to actually require, the amount of storage, the compatibility, and work from there. And so I think it's all really, really interesting how this kind of almost mimics that process, but gives you this full integrated kind of database management service.
Yeah, like if I'm hitting a bunch of errors in here, I'm going to the migration assistant because that's going to give me a much more well-rounded experience. This is, hey, I'm starting a new project. I'm scaffolding out a few things. All right, I want to get that into SQL Azure and see how it plays there. Right, or if I know I've got a pretty straightforward minimal database. I'm going to go try that out. It wouldn't be how I would migrate my production environment necessarily, right? The migration service provides some better tooling and experience there. So, all right, there's one other thing I want to, because Management Studio requires you to be on Windows.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So what do we do if we are working on a Mac, if we're working on Linux, or if we just really, really like a different UI?
I love this.
So we have using this is the Azure
Data Studio.
Yes, Azure Data Studio. I blanked on the name for a moment. So it's Azure Data Studio, and this is built in the Visual Studio Code shell, and it provides us with a way to connect to different data sources. And you can log in with your Azure account. It's going to find all your subscriptions, find all your databases and things. We can, it's got some notebook integration, which I haven't even really played around with yet myself. But of course, we can have, our file explorer if we've got a bunch of our SQL queries and things.
Yeah, if you wanted to load, say, a Jupyter notebook directly from something on your file system into running it as a query or whatever it is, you can use this service. That's really well covered, I think, in the Azure SQL Fundamentals Learn module. There's some parts about how you're going to configure your Data Studio connection, and then eventually how you can do some querying, how you can add, drop, things like that.
And something I love is it has source control integration, right? That early tools, and even in Management Studio, I think it was a little challenging getting source control integrated. And so having source control integration, wonderful. And there's an extensions ecosystem. So, but here again, we can run queries, we can get our results, we can see query plans, we can look at top operations and get stats. So a lot of the information and things that we have that we would normally get in Management Studio, we can get in this little nicer UI, this cross-platform environment, and even as we drill down and we get into like adventure or like I can go in, I can manage and see some information about, about those servers. I can, let's give it a second here to catch up, but, right. It's going to let me do things to manage my database from within this UI that I don't necessarily need. I don't necessarily need to have Management Studio to go do. So this is quickly becoming my favorite SQL experience.
And I know that you could even install it for WSL.
Yeah.
If you're a Windows user, so you get that experience, or just Linux if you're doing that, I would imagine, because I know there's a TarGZ version of it. So you can go to the website on Docs. You can check out this particular doc if you want to download and install the Azure Data Studio. It's really, really useful if you want to work with your SQL databases on Azure. And plus, like I said, it's well covered in that Learn module. So you'll be able to kind of say, oh, let's install this. Let's get our free sandbox so that we can actually work with our database and be ready for it. So, Stephen, we've got about a little less than 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure that you get to this. So you've shown me how to administrate. You showed me how to add data. We've looked into querying, and I know that there's even an embedded query tool that you can use in the actual portal, if I'm right. So I'd love to kind of roll into networking and access control as we get into like the last few minutes.
Yeah, great. So we start for networking and access control. We start at that logical SQL server, right? So we're not in the database. We're at the SQL server level, and right here at the top of overview, we've got this show firewall settings. All right. Helps if I click on the not on the StreamYard version of things, but on the on the actual web page. It's so real. It's like it was there. And so when we go into the firewalls and virtual networks, we can see there's a little help to create private endpoints. So that's to get it onto my local VNet. Right now we're going out over the internet. Then we have this connection policy, right? And so the default connection policy is probably what you want to leave it at. There are two options. There's proxy and redirect. And proxy is what happens when I connect to the Azure SQL gateway, and then it relays my query or my command to the correct database instance, the hardware and the logical software that's running to run my database in Azure. And so there's a little bit of latency added because it's proxied through. Then there's redirect. And redirect, I'd connect to that gateway, but then the client that is connecting to the SQL instance, whether it's SQL native client, whether it's my SDK, whether it's the logic in that tooling would get the redirection IP and would be able to go directly to that particular instance. And so it's a lower latency, and the redirect is the default behavior for services in Azure reaching out to connect to my SQL database. So when we look at connection policy, that's what's happening there. We can, as we saw when we configured, it's easy to turn on to allow Azure's resources and services to connect to that server. So if I want to make it easy to connect from my VMs, I can do that, for example, or from app service, or from a function, or a container instance, whatever would like there. Or we could be more specific. Little
overhead reduction.
Yeah. Yep. And now we could also be more specific and say, nope, I want to whitelist specific IPs or specific IP blocks. And we could also do, we can also balance it out and say, okay, I want to allow Azure services and these specific IPs from out on the internet.
And so then you can add, I can see you can add or create a new virtual network. So if you want to start integrating it into other systems and making connections over a private network only. I suppose that's, or if you have like some sort of DMZ or whatever it is in your network, you can kind of create it and use it there.
Exactly. Yep. So, and there's some nice little helpers here, like add client IP, so that like you don't have to go to what's my IP and find your IP address and things like that. It tells you where you're coming from. It makes it easy to add a rule for yourself. Some of the tooling, like this, for example, this IP address here was getting actually proxied through something else, and it was added by Visual Studio for me. So I was running from somewhere else, and when I went through the Visual Studio connection wizard to deploy something from SSDT, the SQL Server development tools, that the test connection's like, oh, hey, by the way, you don't have the firewall rule for me. You want me to create that? And it uses the Azure APIs then to go create the firewall rule for yourself. So all of this stuff can be automated too. So like if you needed to worry about like your deployment agents and things, you could have them add themselves and then remove themselves, right, from firewall rules as things go. And you can do that programmatically, and it is, again, it's controlled at the server level. So any of the databases that are associated to that virtual server instance are controlled by these firewall policies. You don't control the firewall policies per database.
So we can create single databases that are separate from one another on the same set of logical hardware, right?
Well, on the same set of, like I said, the server is more like a VIP idea, like a virtual IP, and because your hardware instance varies on the database. Now, where databases can share hardware is this idea of elastic pools, and that was something that we hadn't really gotten to yet, but I mentioned it briefly. So maybe we run a set of related databases, and some of them, and we know they have different access profiles. Some require more resources at different times than others. Well, we can take the same hardware and share resources between a set of databases with an elastic pool. And then based on usage, the resources will be reproportioned to them. And that can help us. That can be a little more cost effective, or it could be a way to more effectively utilize the resources that we're assigning to our databases themselves.
Gotcha. So, Steve, we just got about maybe a minute and a half left.
Yeah.
And I wanted to kind of be able to wrap up things. I know you could give me so much more on this, and maybe we'll do another session on some more advanced options, since we just talked kind of, basics today. But I wanted to go and I wanted to show we've got our poll. Are you using it? 60% say yes, and we thank you for doing that. We really appreciate you giving some information to us, and also want to say thank you to all the people who took part in asking questions. There's a lot of comments in the in this chat today. If we didn't get to your question today, Stephen, where can people find you to be able to ask you more?
Yeah, Twitter is probably the easiest place, and I'm at Stephen Murawski, as on my lower third there. You can also find me on LinkedIn, and those are probably the easiest places to find me and ask. And I would really suggest and recommend go check out that Learn module that Jay mentioned, where it goes through the Azure SQL fundamentals, and it can bring a lot of these concepts home and give you a really good start on taking advantage of all that it has to offer.
Absolutely. So, Steve, I think it's time for us to give everybody the big wave goodbye. I wanted to say thank you so much. I really appreciate your time here. You've been great. You're always great. And we'll do this again, okay? Because, hey, we did this back in, I found this from February. and how times have changed, and I lost the beard. But, things are still the same, and will still be the same here on Thursday next week for another Azure Fun Bites. We'll be talking about Azure Bicep. I'll have Alex Frankel from that team. I think it'll be really interesting. So until then, We'll see you all next time. Take care. Be good to one another. Bye, Steve.